most people, I think, even composers, have typically written from a dark place. As I
Mm,
think about the history of many composers, from Beethoven to Mozart to then Chopin and other things, the most beautiful music typically has come from a dark place. A lot
mm,
of good music has come from a happy place in terms of like they're in a good space and they're doing well and all that good stuff too. And we can hear it if your ear is really acute and in tune for those things, and but the emotion, I think, is that what it's attached to, is because we will relate it to something of our own experiences within our own lives that will bring these feelings out. And it will either get you going through your workday, or it'll either trigger, or it'll set off a specific memory for
mhm.
you to go down a memory lane or a rabbit hole, and then it's a turnbuckle from there.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the e-marketing association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
One of the interesting conferences I was at recently, I ran into Chase Bethea, who helps compose music for video games, but it really got me thinking about music as a marketing vehicle and like the old days of when every brand had a jingle, and the importance of audio from a recall perspective, and the importance of audio from an emotion generation perspective. So Chase, first of all, tell people, how'd you get into doing music composition for video games? That seems like a really interesting niche.
Yeah. So I started, there's a couple of different ways I usually tell the story, but there was a path where I was going to be a assistant, and then that didn't work out. And then I was going to be at a game studio where I was doing an internship at while I was in community college at the time, Moore Park Community College. And then that studio had some issues and they split. And then I decided to buy a book called The Complete Guide to Game Audio by Aaron Marks, second edition. And I read half of the book. And then I saw in the book that you should be on forums. So I went there and then I pitched my music to a couple of game developers that were doing stuff in the hobby section, because I knew I had to kind of do a portfolio. I didn't know anything about game jams at the time, but the hobby part seemed like it was safe and it wasn't something I need professional toes in that regard. So I figured it was okay. And then it turned into a paid gig and it ended up being my first ship game. So even though those other paths didn't typically go down a traditional way, I would say, that is how I ended up into doing video game music. And then I did learn about game jams and then linked up with different developers and therefore continued on my process and my path through that.
So, obviously with sort of regular music composition, right? I mean, you've got sort of a couple of different categories. You've got musicians who write for themselves or they write for their bands, and they have their particular inspirations. And then you've got sort of a for hire category of stuff, which is includes things like, writing movie music scores, or writing advertising music for 60-second TV spots, or even a portion of a 60-second spot. And
Yeah,
then you've got, this entirely separate category, which is game development. But the common thing about sort of game development and to sort of for hire music is, somebody else has this vision of something they want to accomplish, right?
right,
And so they have to give you something to work on, like it's a first person shooter or it's a brain game or whatever. And they like almost like a movie director, right, or cinematographer sort of potentially guiding that music. There's somebody who's sort of guiding your music composition. And I think in
right.
the case of marketing, right, similarly, if I want you to write a jingle for a TV commercial, right, I probably have some guidance that I give you. So I'd love to understand how in the video game world, like you don't get to start with a blank slate and do whatever the hell you want. Like somebody gives you some guidance, right? And how does that influence your creative process?
It depends on the project, actually. There are some blank slates where I do get to do what I want. And I think because of what I've done musically with the games that I've done, I'm now known as the Swiss Army knife of video game composition in the industry. And I've worked hard at that title because I knew that video game composition could be any type of genre, and I can even conflate them now in terms of it being more than just like one or two styles. It can be up to three different styles all in one. So yes, there is some kind of there it's an entire art form coming together. It's 50% of
Right.
the experience. But in terms of it does get me the liberty of being able to do something on my own with a tiny minimal of guidance, or sometimes they trust me so much where they're just saying, hey, just do your thing. And then it may roll back of, okay, now we're trying to fit this and they may fit that. But it just depends on who I'm working with, the mindset they have, the influences that are inspiring them, and to go from there. So, but the purpose of it is to capture that emotion for the player. And I'm a player first before I was a musician. So that's how I normally am able to kind of do a trajectory and have the persuasions to know what's going on, what happens within the game before it's actually at its end product.
Interesting. So, are you usually composing the music at the storyboard level, or do they or usually have a rough cut of the game already coded before they're looking to you to compose the music?
Either or, it depends on it really just comes down to which developer I'm working with. If they've got concepts and things and there's no vertical slice or type of early builds, then it's just mostly a game design document or maybe some early concept art. One of the long-term clients that I have, Fancy Fish Games, and the team that I work with, they're very quick. So they can have something, if they just throw some minimal type of assets from things before, the programmer is so fast. If you wanted to concept something today and have it for me just to kind of idealize and do a conspectus of type of musical themes, then yeah, he can have it in like a couple hours or so. So it's really indicative in terms of the skill set and the mindset of where it is and the scope of the project as well. Bigger project things, more people involved, team of 50 plus, it's not going to typically happen like that. The team I'm talking about is mostly two people. So that's the difference that happens there.
Yep, yep. So, I'd love to talk about how you think through the emotion level, right? Because that's one thing that marketers they want recall, right? So obviously, a lot when you think about audio being used in commercial environments, typically like video-based commercials, right? They'll want to go short. They'll want to go like a few tones, like something that they can repeat, something that is very memorable, right? It's almost like the marketing equivalent of the ET movie, right? They want to
Right.
have it
Yeah.
short, super memorable, like, oh yeah, I know what that's from, right? So in that case, you can hear the commercial, and like by the time those tones are over, you can almost play the commercial out in your head, right?
Right.
Now,
Right.
whereas video games, you're engaging over a longer period of time, but the common theme there is this emotion, right? You're evoking a certain emotion that lines up typically with a visual asset, right? Obviously, in the case of audio for commercials, if it's not a video commercial, it's just like on Spotify or on the old school radio, you won't have the benefit of that, but you still want to create this emotional trigger. So, how do you think about emotions as you compose music, right? And obviously, you've got easy stuff like is it in a major key or a minor key? And then you've got all sorts of other tools in your tool chest.
Right. Yeah. This is kind of pulling on my personal feelings of the emotions as I'm thinking about it. It's starting to come out a bit. So just bear with me a little bit here.
Sure.
The the emotions typically come from a place of someone that could be your muse, and
Mhm.
then or some place of an internal feeling that you're having,
Right.
and or that really is just it's a translation of energy. It's an
Hmm.
alchemization of energy specifically. And if you're in a really good place mentally, then typically those emotions will come out, even if you have to write something in a minor key, but you can translate it into at least being good in a way, whereas in you'll most likely be able to you won't have so much creative blocks.
Right.
And but if you're in a different space and you're in the dark place of that can be a little bit tricky to navigate as well.
Hmm.
And that comes from it most people, I think, even composers, have typically written from a dark place. As I
Hmm.
think about the history of many composers, from Beethoven to Mozart to then Chopin and other things, the most beautiful music typically has come from a dark place. A lot
Hmm.
of good music has come from a happy place in terms of like they're in a good space and they're doing well and all that good stuff too. And we can hear it if your ear is really acute and in tune for those things, and but the emotion, I think, is that what it's attached to, is because we will relate it to something of our own experiences within our own lives that will bring these feelings out. And it will either get you going through your workday, or it'll either trigger, or it'll set off a specific memory for
Mhm.
you to go down a memory lane or a rabbit hole, and then it's a turnbuckle from there. And
Right.
so for me, these emotions, I have to be even more careful because I'm more vulnerable through them, I found. And I
Mhm.
have to, when I need to tap into it to be able to achieve a specific milestone, I have to decide now, is this the creative space I want to be in, and where am I going to go and how far I'm going to go? Because if I go too far, then I'll be in that state for a longer period of time than I need to be. And that's the thing, just being really in touch with who I am as a composer and myself and my mindset, and just being cognizant of that, and then and learning how to alchemize that energy properly and allocate it in the right way, so that I'm not looking at it about what is it about me, but it's about an art form for others that I think can explore. And then hopefully those attachments through the bigger art form with the story and the mechanics, they're fish line pulling through, but they're also landing the marks of where you're able to encapsulate that. And then if you were away from it, it has that sonic identity to think, if you weren't in the room, oh, I know that specific melody, I know that specific sound, I know that specific texture, I can even say, that takes you a
Mm.
little bit further and pulls you into it.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about sonic identity, because I think that's what the marketers are going to be very interested in, is like, okay, I need to create a sonic identity that resonates with my brand overall.
Right,
But then when it comes to specific commercials or ads, right? In that case, I'm really more generating a score that accompanies a story, more like a
right,
movie score, right? And those
right,
two things, can they coexist together, right? Because so sort of the sonic branding, or just something that you always want to have start your ad out or whatever, that can have a certain feeling to it. Maybe it's only 4 to 10 notes long, right? And then you've sort of got something that might go along with a, a 30-second spot, right? Where it's
right,
almost like a mini movie, right? And you're sort of accompanying that. And
right,
in video game advertising, of course, to some extent, the player is making their own movie, right? And so you have to figure out, how do you score that, right?
right.
So how should marketers think about, creating an audio identity that resonates with their brand and their brand ethos, right? And does that influence how the remainder of their music should be scored?
Yeah, it's very, I think the importance of that is the sonic identity has been around for such a long time. And even if we think about the NBC, pitch tone, doom, 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 right? It's just three
Right.
notes. But if I sing it, oh, that's NBC. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, however you are, didn't see it graphically, tonally, that's
Yeah.
what it is. They've done a good job of branding that so that it hasn't changed. It may be a different instrument, it may be something else, but those notes are in the exact mostly same tonality center. And
Yeah.
so that's brand and that's marketing at its finest. And then there's different companies that are now coming around and understanding, like Nissan is having a new one, and a couple other companies too, especially cars, are getting the idea of, okay, I might have, let's brand that with some, it doesn't have to be a really fast jingle or entire score that goes with it. We just need something to identify this with us.
Mhm.
And as long as that continues on, Netflix is another thing. YouTube is another one where you turn on these apps and you hear doom, okay, yeah, someone turned on Netflix. Or the bop, like, is the YouTube. So as you can tell, I'm attuned to this because I've watched these or I'm familiar with it. But I think it's really cool, and I think it's coming from me as a child knowing little bit about this by making different noises and other things too, and then associating it with those things. And now I'm seeing it in a professional form in a manner
Yeah.
that is really tied in to just making sure that they are remembered.
So, what's interesting about, traditional pop music or whatever, is that, a certain number of exposures to a song, even if you don't like the song, right, it sort of ends up burning itself into your memory,
Yeah,
right? And certainly from a sonic branding perspective, that's sort of also true. I'm wondering if from the video game world, is there any data, either anecdotally or that you've seen, that says, oh yeah, well, you sort of have to hear it X number of times before you become associated with that, right? Is there sort of like a
Sure.
tipping point where all of a sudden you're like, yeah, you're probably in their brain now. So now you just need to play the tones and it'll evoke that reaction.
Yeah, I think it depends on like it's this is a fine balance that if you do it right. And
Yeah.
so when you're writing the music, you want to have the theme associated for that sonic identity. What I usually do is I attribute it to writing in terms of a sonic palette. And because video games came from a limitation of space, there was basic chipsets from the PS1 to the Atari to the Game Boy and NES that was only is a specific sound for those type of console systems. So I'm treating, even though we don't have those limitations anymore necessarily, I'm treating every game as if they were a specific chipset specifically. And so
Interesting.
with that written into the theme, then and the themes of maybe depending on what type of character it is, if it's a puzzle game, then I know it's going to be a theme of the puzzle game whenever we play, and I'm going to make some variations based off of that. As long as there's a consistency with the texture, then that is meaning okay, you've heard it, the oboe and this synth little sound and these drums. And so, but now in this part, you're hearing the same thing, but in a different variety of a form.
Hmm.
That at least will be like the sonic identity for the chipset palette, or not chipset, but the sound palette that is attributed to that. And then over time, what should happen, yes, is that it's a subconscious thing. It's not something that stood out to you, but it's subconsciously you've now through osmosis absorbed these tones, these textures, these melodies, and these counter melodies even, and something is sitting with you because you're spending more than an hour with a couple of different senses. You at least have, if you're for controller, you have your touch, you have your sight, and you have your hearing.
Right.
So those three are working in tandem of some sort to kind of be put together in form of a solid memory that you will have with an experience that you're going to take forward in your life. So when you turn that game off, you're left with two senses left. Well, you're left with one sense. You're left with this conscious oral sense, which is internally in your memory. And if you close your eyes, and if you played the game a long time, if you did over 100 hours, then you'll be able to see the game too, which I hope you did it. But you understand what I'm saying. So there's just those residues, those good residues of experiences that come from that. If the game is done well, it's like it's a subconscious part. You heard the melody, the counter melody, the texture, and when you leave, it's with you. And it should, if it's a good game overall with the story, like I said, all art forms that are conflated and delivered tells the story properly so that you may even want to come back, has a replayability, and builds a somewhat future nostalgia for you in that respect too, because nostalgia doesn't happen to be always in an adolescent form. You can experience adult nostalgia and for those many years that you are fond of something that you really enjoyed.
Right. Right. So I'd love for you to go a little bit more because marketers aren't probably familiar with the idea of texture, right, as it
Mm.
relates to sound. And similarly, like I'd love you to sort of describe that and what you mean by that and how marketers might embrace changing texture once they decide what their sonic identity is, or just for texture when they're going to score an ad, as well as sort of the opportunities to maybe rearrange, right? To just do different arrangements of the
Yes.
same song, right? Because you hear when people do covers, for example, right? In the regular music industry, sometimes you'll be like, oh, wow, that was a really interesting rearrangement of, a really interesting cover, right? And some of them will even, the cover will sometimes be right up there with the original. And you'll be like, that was just such a reimagination of the song, right? So how should marketers think about that from the perspective of both texture and maybe rearrangement?
I'm going to use food as an example, and I think this will be a very ubiquitous type of form of an analogy.
Right.
Let's use lasagna because what I'm going to describe in terms of the relation, I'll come back around to it.
Yeah.
If you had your mom's lasagna or your aunt's lasagna or your grandmother's lasagna, whoever, they have a specific recipe that comes with it. You have your specific noodles, you have your specific sauce. If it's vegan and you're not using the meat or whatever type of meat, if you're so on and so forth. And these all come down to the texture of everything coming together. There are layers between all those ingredients, and however it's cooked and however it's prepared, there's a texture and a palette that comes with it.
Mm.
And if you overcook it, it's going to be, if obviously it's going to be too hard, it's going to be burnt. The top of the cheese is not melted just right. It depends where you get the cheese too, right? All of these things come down to the texture and the taste,
Hmm.
make it palatable in terms of the digestion and what your enjoyment will come from. So within music and texture, you have like you said, there's, let's say it's the AC/DC song, and we know what those instruments layers and recipes are. They have the two guitars, the bass and the drums, and you have the specific vocals that are going on. Those are your ingredients of what creates that entire texture and that sound, along with the mix engineer who glued these specific things together using a specific type of equipment. So I know I'm going to get a little technical, but all of this stuff matters because the same equipment that's used on that iconic song that AC/DC uses is not going to be the same that this cover artist used to cover that AC/DC song. They don't have that mix engineer. They may not have those guitars. They know they can sing, they know the chords of the song, and they know the melody. Those are the things that are consistent, right? Lasagna, these are the things, you got to have noodles, you got to have the sauce, you got to have the cheese. So you got to have the melody, you got to have the chords, and you got to have like the mixing, to cover with it. But the equipment of how you get those things are not going to be equivalent. So the texture is going to obviously be different, just like if you went to Chi-Chi's to go to get lasagna versus Yano's. Right. And so that's not going to be the same. It's the same correlation. The
Yeah.
cover artist has the specific sound of their voice. They have they might have did a different rhythm, slightly of the melody, slightly of the chords, definitely different, not the same engineer, not the same recording equipment, not the same guitars, etc. And so what you'll hear is, okay, it sounds familiar, but the texture is different because they have different things that are incorporated in that. And that's the difference of where that comes from. Now, as long as it sonically is almost up to par, meaning you can hear everything all together, right? If this is, and that means it's quote like baked well, I'm going to use the lasagna type of thing, and then you can achieve that in a different form. And that's where you were talking about the arrangements might be different. Let's take the cover artist didn't use those instruments. Now we're going to go to a different texture. We're going to go big. We're going to go with big band. And so we've got 6 horns, we've got 7 saxophones, we've got the Sousa, we've got also clarinets and woodwinds. All of those create different timbres that create a larger texture, same melody, same chords, same type of recording things that you want to do, but the sound is going to be different, and the sound of the texture is what I'm talking about. But it's you obviously, if it's the same thing that you're using with those 3 parts, it's just the difference. You're swapping out different ingredients, I would say, in terms of what the instrumentation would be in terms of correlation with that.
Right, right. So it sounds like that could end up being really powerful from a game designer's perspective as well, right? So within different parts of the game, you can have things be thematically tied together, but you have a lot of ability to sort of reinterpret, what you've done and change texture and change the arrangement, but yet continue to reinforce the underlying sort of repeating portion of the notes, basically.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and those are excuse me, composer tools that are devices. Typically, you learn in counterpoint, as a very old writing technique from the classical era, and those techniques are what reinforce us to remember and solidify what those are attributed to in our mind.
Right, right. Well, I think the message for marketers who might be watching or listening then is, you know, you as your campaigns change, you don't necessarily have to throw away what you've done before, right? You can
Very simple.
adapt things
Yeah.
and do change your arrangement, change the texture to fit different scenarios. And as long as you're sort of close enough to that core, the human brain will still make the connection.
Yeah, McDonald's is actually brilliant with this. They understand that the da 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 da, right? They've done it so many different variations. They had a vocalist do it. They just have like a little xylophone do it. It just depends. Like, okay, we want the children to do this, so we just need this. It needs to be the same. It needs to be State Farm is another one. They, now they got the snap, but you can sing it and then you have the little thing, and it depends where it is. Even when I think they had like a game version where they were using a chipset style, so it's the same correlation, the same notes, but different things are replaced in terms of where that's going to go. That's
Right.
it.
Yeah, cool. So What has you excited about the next year as it relates to the intersection of games and music? And actually, there's a sort of existential threat, at least in people's minds, about AI replacing you. Like, so how are you thinking about that?
In terms of AI replacing me, I'm not concerned at all. They're not going to have my personal life experiences, and man, God bless them if they want it, because I'm not so sure. So you got to be able to want to deal with what I'm dealing with up here first, and if you can make that better or navigate, hats off and a salute to you. I use AI and have been using AI in this respect in terms of it being more so as an assistant or like an extra tool. And so with the work that has been coming through in terms of they have mixing that kind of goes along with, oh, this is the type of music arrangement you have, and let's analyze all the instruments that you have and let's see what you get close to, and it creates some kind of temporary preset, and you can tweak it, you can go along with it. And then what I've spoken about before on a different interview, I said some years ago, whereas I've thought of AI kind of being a really cool chord assistant in terms of, okay, well, maybe I got stuck with my theory that day. I'm very lethargic and I want to think of this A flat major chord and change it to something else and see where it goes. But I've done something like this before, and I wanted something different. And so I try something, and then the AI responds to me and says, okay, you could do that, or you could do this. How about that? And then I can argue with it and say, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to do this instead. But it depends on, I think it's just really cool if you just have that in your arsenal, and if you just play around and experiment and tinker. That's how I see it.
So would you say that it adds speed or velocity to your creative process, or does it actually end up changing your creative process having AI as an assistant?
I think it would be an amalgamation of both. You are changing your creative process in a way because you have outside of your mind's help and something to kind of interact with. I usually kind of correlate it to the Windows 2000 dog, that little dog with a little or something over the pen.
The
I can't remember
Clippy as well,
the
I
Clippy.
think.
Yeah, that one too. Like, so it was saying, hey, you could do this way, and oh yeah, okay, sure, I guess. But one day you might think, actually, it might be a little bit helpful, and so if you accept the help, obviously you accentuate and you push forward your efficiency with working. And if you accept the help more, then you will probably get into a workflow that's more creative and more expedited. And it does change because it's just like collaborating with someone else. You aren't just doing it by yourself. Someone else is giving their input in for a different output.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Is thinking about AI from a creative perspective as a collaborator, right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to something that replaces you more of, if you think about it as a collaborator, I think that's a step beyond thinking about it as a tool, right? Because a lot of people say, oh, it's just a tool in my tool chest. Okay, well, that may be true, but for anybody in the creative world, whether they're creative as a visual artist or a design artist or a musical artist or whatever, I think thinking about it as a collaborator is perhaps a better framework, right? Because it underscores the importance of that the joint collaboration.
You're actually right. I've never thought of it in that process because I think I've been preparing for this for I'm going to say this boldly, 20 something years. I only say that because I'm thinking of the movie AI with Haley Joel Osment and that movie. And I thought about Bicentennial Man, and then Detroit Become Human came out some years ago. And so I always thought, okay, and Ex Machina. So those four type of movies have prepared my mind in terms of what's to come and how well it could, what they did and how they told the story, and what, if you use it in that way, what could become of it. And then there's obviously Tomb Raider 2. Not Tomb Raider, Terminator 2 with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And that is okay, well, Skynet and all this other stuff. But if you just change your mindset about it, and I approach it in terms of, well, it can't do this and it won't do that right now. What is it right now? Right now, it's this. It feels like a collaboration. I think that's how I perceive it.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks so much for like getting us all to stretch our minds about, music and audio and its importance from a marketing perspective and from a storytelling perspective. I appreciate you joining me on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Kevin. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, If Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.